My mom chose my sister's engagement over my life, so I cut them off after what happened in the kitchen, and then I never thought I'd be the kind of person to feel like a stranger in my own family's house. But that's exactly how I felt standing outside the big white colonial on Chestnut Street in Providence, where I was raised alongside my younger sister Delilah. From the outside, the house still looked perfect, curtains drawn with precision, flower pots in their usual symmetrical positions on the porch, the whole thing wrapped in climbing ivy like it had been staged for a magazine cover. But all I could feel was the cold, not from the New England winter, but from somewhere deeper. I had just gotten out of work, my back aching, my head foggy from yet another long day of patience and fluorescent lights. The Children's Medical Center in downtown Providence had been my home more than this house ever was. I had been a physician there for almost 12 years now, long enough to have memorized the creaky hallway floors, the smell of antiseptic mixed with worn-out coffee machines, and the 1,000 different ways parents try to hold themselves together when bad news arrives. The elevator in the clinic had barely closed before Nurse Ainsley poked her head in and said, "That's the last one, Dr. Clare. Go get some rest." She didn't even wait for me to respond, just gave me a tired half-smile and walked off. I remember leaning back in my chair for just a moment, closing my eyes and letting my hands fall to the curve of my belly. 6 months in, and I still couldn't quite believe I was finally pregnant. After 3 rounds of IVF, for miscarriages, and 1,000 whispered prayers I never believed would work, here I was. And yet, as I sat there touching the proof of everything I had fought for, my phone buzzed. My mother's name, Margot, flashed on the screen, as elegant and cold as her voice. I stared at it for a long moment before finally answering. "Claire, darling," she said before I could speak. "Just confirming you'll be at dinner tomorrow. We're finalizing the plans for Delilah's engagement soiree. It's going to be absolutely magnificent." I told her I'd come, but that I'd be late because I had a prenatal appointment scheduled. She sighed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just the kind of faint exhale that carried a lifetime of disapproval. "You're always so busy. Couldn't you make more of an effort for your sister? Just this once?" I felt something tighten behind my ribcage. It was a familiar ache, the kind that came not from physical strain but from emotional exhaustion. Even after graduating med school with honors, even after becoming one of the hospital's youngest department leads, nothing I did ever seemed to warrant attention. My mother had always kept her gaze fixed on Delilah, her golden girl, the one with the magazine covers, the sponsored vacations, the perfect fiancé. Meanwhile, I was the responsible one, the one who paid bills on time, called during storms, sent flowers for birthdays she wasn't invited to. "All right, Mom," I said, because there was no point arguing. "I'll come after my appointment." After I hung up, I just sat there for a while in the darkening room. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just let the silence settle on my shoulders like an old sweater that never quite fit right. That night, in the car on the way home, I called my best friend Carol. She was the only person who ever really heard me, the only one who didn't shrink my concerns into selfishness. "Preparations for the grand event have begun," I told her, half joking. She paused before answering. "Are you okay? Weren't you supposed to be resting?" I told her I was fine. I wasn't. My blood pressure had been creeping up for the past month, and my last test showed protein traces in my urine, an early sign of preeclampsia. The doctor had told me to cut down on stress, to rest, to take care of myself. But how do you do that when your family expects you to perform like nothing's changed? "Claire," Carol said gently, "you need to put yourself and the baby first. You can't keep burning yourself out just to keep the peace." But that's exactly what I had always done, kept the peace, swallowed the tension, bit down on disappointment like it was communion. Because when you grow up knowing that love in your house comes with fine print, you learn not to ask for more. When I got home, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The light above buzzed faintly, and I stared at the picture frame hanging on the wall, a photo of me and Jonah taken on our last trip together before his deployment. He was smiling, holding my hand like it was the only thing anchoring him to the ground. I missed him so much it hurt sometimes. He was halfway across the world, patching up civilians in Sierra Leone with a nonprofit medical team. We had met in Haiti a decade earlier, both volunteers with Doctors Without Borders. He understood this life. Understood me. I texted him before bed. Appointments at 3 tomorrow. Wish you were here. He replied 10 minutes later, probably after stepping out of a tent hospital into the barely there signal. I wish that too. 2 more weeks, and I'll be home. Let me know how the little one's doing. Love you. Reading those words, I felt a sharp contrast between his quiet, constant love and the shallow approval I had always chased from my mother. Jonah never needed me to shine or impress anyone. I could just be Claire. Messy, tired, stubborn Claire, with calloused hands and swollen ankles, and a baby growing inside her like a miracle. The next day came with another phone call. This time, it was from Delilah. Hey, big sis, she chirped. Are you bringing the invitations? Mom said you double-checked the seating chart. She doesn't want any last-minute surprises. I told her yes, even though I had never volunteered to manage any of it. I was supposed to be resting. But rest didn't exist in my family, not when something needed to be done. I got the ring resized again, Delilah added casually. It's like a full carat bigger now. Brandon said I deserved something rare. Of course he did. That was Delilah's world. Lavish things. Attention like oxygen. The kind of compliments that came pre-wrapped in gold tissue paper. You'll love it, she added. Everyone will. It's going to be the party of the year. I wanted to say something. Anything. But all I could do was nod into the phone and pretend I wasn't counting the hours until Jonah came home and I could finally fall apart in someone's arms. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. I told myself it was just hormones, maybe fatigue. But in the back of my mind, I knew it was something more. Something harder to admit. I was terrified. Not just of the complications, or the pregnancy, or even labor. I was terrified of giving birth in a world where I had no real place in the family that raised me. And even more afraid of what would happen if I let that truth catch up with me. The appointment the next afternoon was supposed to be routine. My obstetrician, Dr. Amanda Howell, was direct but kind. The sort of woman who looked like she'd been born inside a lab coat and had spent her entire life perfecting the art of controlled concern. After checking my vitals, she sat back in her chair with a sigh that didn't feel casual. Claire, she said, looking me dead in the eye, your blood pressure's gone up again, and your labs show elevated protein. I know you're a physician, so I won't sugarcoat this. If things progress, we're looking at preeclampsia. I stared at the ultrasound image still flickering on the monitor beside her, my daughter's small form moving slightly, as if responding to the tension filling the room. You need to be on full bed rest. No stress. No obligations. And if things worsen, we'll need to admit you. I nodded like I understood, and of course I did. Medically, logically, professionally. But emotionally, there was a chasm between knowing what was necessary and actually stepping away from everything expected of me. Do you have someone to stay with you? She asked gently, probably already knowing the answer. My husband's overseas, I said. 2 more weeks until he's back. She frowned. Anyone else? I paused before answering. My family's busy with an event. I didn't mention the part where my mother barely acknowledged my pregnancy unless it interfered with Delilah's wedding plans. I didn't explain how the only support I could count on lived next door and wasn't even related to me. I just left the office with a note in my file and the echo of her warning bouncing around in my head. I should have gone straight home and laid down like she told me to. Instead, I drove directly to my mother's house because I knew if I didn't show up that day, she would send a dozen messages and follow up with a phone call filled with barely disguised disappointment. When I arrived, the place looked like a small event planning firm had exploded inside it. People were everywhere, arranging silverware, fluffing floral centerpieces, and testing lighting near the dining room windows. The engagement party was still 3 days away, but Margot ran her household like a military operation. Nothing less than flawless was acceptable. She didn't even look up when I walked in. You're late, she said, pointing toward a stack of place cards. Go through those, will you? Delilah changed her mind about the guest list again. I took a breath, stepped out of my shoes, and made my way into the dining room where place cards sat like tiny soldiers awaiting deployment. Delilah's laughter floated from the living room, and it struck me just how light she always sounded. Effortlessly unbothered, perpetually adored. "You're sure you should be on your feet?" a voice said from behind me. I turned and saw Estelle, the neighbor who somehow always managed to show up at the exact moment I needed her most. She was holding a tray of drinks, clearly recruited by Margot into some kind of unofficial service role. "I'm fine," I said too quickly, which made her narrow her eyes in that grandmotherly way that said she wasn't buying it. I placed a hand on my belly, hoping the baby couldn't feel the emotional chaos churning under my skin. That evening, I sat on the edge of the guest bed upstairs, too tired to go home, too angry to cry. I texted Jonah again, telling him I'd had a long day, that the doctor said to rest, and that I'd try to lie low until he got back. He responded a few minutes later, asking if I needed him to arrange for someone, anyone, to help. I told him no, because what was I supposed to say? That my own mother had made it clear I was more of a nuisance than an expecting daughter? The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and swelling in my hands so bad I couldn't get my rings off. I debated going to the hospital, but the voice in my head, Margot's voice, honestly, said I was overreacting, that I could handle it, that I was strong. So I got dressed, dabbed some color onto my cheeks, and went downstairs. That was the day everything cracked. Margot was giving some elaborate instructions to the catering team when I asked if I could speak to her. She barely looked up, just waved me toward the kitchen with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "I need to talk to you," I said again, more firmly this time. She turned around slowly, like I had just interrupted a sermon. "What is it? Make it quick. The florist's running late. My doctor says I need complete bed rest. She mentioned hospitalization if it gets worse." She stared at me like I had just spoken a foreign language. "You're saying you won't be at the party?" "I'm saying I need to rest. For the baby." "You always do this," she said, shaking her head. "You find some excuse to pull focus away from your sister." Delilah came in at that moment, flipping her perfect blonde hair over her shoulder like a shampoo commercial. She was already in her fitting gown for the rehearsal dinner that night, and when she saw my expression, she rolled her eyes. "Is this another health thing?" she said, smirking. "You always bring drama right before something important." I felt my chest tighten. "It's not drama, Delilah. It's a medical complication. I might be going into early labor." "You're a doctor," she snapped. "You've always used that like some kind of shield. You think that makes you more important than me." "I never said that." "No, but you act like it." Her words hit harder than I expected, even though I'd heard worse before. For some reason, hearing them now, while I stood in that kitchen, barely able to stand, my head spinning with pain, it all felt too much. "I'll be there," I said finally. "I won't ruin anything." Delilah smiled, satisfied, and turned back toward the living room. Margot just nodded and returned to her list. That night, I barely slept. The guest bed felt like a slab of concrete under my swollen limbs, and the pain in my head had turned into something relentless. I kept whispering to the baby, trying to soothe her with the same words I couldn't offer myself. The next morning, the house was buzzing even louder. Trucks were arriving, deliveries stacked by the front door, a photographer snapping early shots of the event setup. I forced myself out of bed, still half dizzy, and got dressed slowly. My hands trembled so badly I couldn't hook my bra. I braced myself on the dresser, took 3 long breaths, and kept going. By the time I made it downstairs, everyone was too busy to notice me. Until the first real contraction hit. It stole my breath and doubled me over. I caught myself against the back of a sofa, and when I looked up, Margot was staring at me from across the room. "What now?" she asked, not kindly. "I'm in labor," I said. "Or something's wrong. I need to go to the hospital." "You're due in 3 months," she said. "That's not labor." My water broke. That got her attention, but only for a moment. "Fine," she muttered. "Call a car." "An Uber?" I asked, voice cracking. "We have guests arriving in 30 minutes, she said. "We can't just abandon everything." Delilah walked in at that exact moment, her heels clicking across the floor like punctuation. "You can't be serious," she said. "You're really doing this right now?" I couldn't respond. The next wave of pain ripped through me like fire. All I could do was hold onto the countertop and pray. That's when I realized, if I didn't get out of that house on my own, I wasn't going to make it. I don't know how I stayed conscious after that second contraction. My whole body seized up, muscles locking and breath caught in my throat like a scream that refused to come out. I leaned harder into the edge of the counter, pressing my weight down to stay upright. I couldn't fall. I couldn't collapse. If I went down in that moment, I didn't think I'd be able to get back up again. Margot kept adjusting place settings like I had just coughed too loudly during a church service. She glanced toward the hallway, probably to see if any guests had arrived, and then turned back to me with that same cool expression she wore during charity galas. "I'll call a car," she said finally, as though that solved everything. "Just pull yourself together until then. We can't have people seeing you like this." I stared at her, sweat trickling down my temple, feeling like I was in someone else's nightmare. This couldn't be my life. Surely this was someone else's mother, someone else's sister, someone else being told that their early labor was an inconvenience. Delilah leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed and a glass of champagne in one hand, wearing a white dress that looked like it cost more than my entire monthly salary. "You always know how to ruin a moment," she said with a smirk, twisting her ring on her finger for effect. I tried to speak, to explain again that something was wrong, that this wasn't some melodramatic cry for attention. But the pain clamped down on my ribs again, and all I could manage was a strangled whimper as I doubled over once more. "Mom, she's getting the floor wet," Delilah said, disgusted, like I'd spilled wine on a sofa cushion. That was when I felt the warmth on my legs, the unmistakable rush of fluid. My water had broken completely, soaking through my dress and pooling on the kitchen tiles beneath me. My fingers gripped the counter so tightly I thought I might snap one off. I looked up at my mother, eyes wide with panic. "My water broke," I said again, voice trembling. Margot's mouth pressed into a thin line. She didn't rush forward, didn't reach for me. She didn't even flinch. She just turned and whispered something to the florist in the hallway, then returned to the kitchen, checking her watch like she was measuring the time between my contractions and the arrival of hors d'oeuvres. "Claire, listen to me," she said in a low voice, as if we were discussing misbehaving children instead of a medical emergency. "We have nearly 300 guests arriving today, including Brandon's parents and the board members from the Hyatt Group. You need to handle this without creating a scene." I looked at her in disbelief. "You want me to go to the hospital, alone, after my water broke, while in premature labor? We can't afford a scandal," she said simply, then called out toward the hall. "I'll send for a ride now." I couldn't feel my legs anymore. I was shaking, hands trembling so badly, I almost dropped my phone when I pulled it from my pocket. I scrolled through my contacts with blurred vision, passing Jonah's name even though my heart ached for him, because I knew he couldn't help, not from a continent away. That's when I saw Estelle's name. She wasn't family. She wasn't even supposed to be in the house today. But something inside me, pure desperation, maybe, told me she was the only one I could count on. I tapped her number with fingers that barely worked and pressed the phone to my ear. "Claire," she answered, her voice soft with surprise. I tried to respond, but the words tangled in my throat. "Claire, what's wrong?" "I need help," I whispered, slurring my words. "The baby, early labor, I'm bleeding." The phone slipped from my hand and hit the tile floor with a crack. The sound echoed through the room, louder than anything else. I don't remember hitting the ground. I only remember the coldness of it against my skin and the echo of Estelle's voice shouting my name through the phone speaker before everything faded to black. When I woke again, there were hands on me. Voices. Lights. Something tight around my face. "Her blood pressure's dangerously high," a woman said near my head. "And there's fetal distress." I blinked slowly, pain pulsing behind my eyes, as I felt myself being lifted onto a stretcher. A warm hand gripped mine, fingers trembling. "It's okay, Claire," Estelle said softly. "I'm here. You're not alone." I tried to speak, but the oxygen mask muffled everything. One of the paramedics adjusted the 4 in my arm, while another pressed something cool against my forehead. "We're transporting her to Memorial," the lead medic said to Estelle. "Can you notify her family?" "They're busy with an event," Estelle answered carefully. The medic's jaw clenched. He didn't say anything else, but the look he gave her said enough. It said they're monsters without needing to speak the words aloud. Inside the ambulance, machines beeped. My ears rang. My chest ached from how hard my heart was pounding. I couldn't see straight anymore. But I remember the words one of the EMTs said quietly to another. This is what neglect looks like. The emergency room was chaos. A blur of motion and bright lights. A nurse shouted for blood. A doctor called for a crash cart. They were losing me, and they all knew it. Somewhere in the chaos, I heard a faint cry, the sound of a life arriving too early. She's here, someone called out. Another voice answered, NICU now. We've got her stabilized. Then everything went quiet again. I came to later, hours or maybe days later, in a hospital bed under dim light. My body felt like it had been through war. My mouth was dry, my head pounding, and my stomach hollow. A nurse sat beside me, holding my wrist gently, checking my pulse. You're awake, she whispered, smiling with eyes full of kindness. Your daughter's okay. She's tiny, but she's strong. Tears welled in my eyes and spilled onto the pillow. Her name, I croaked. Her name is Hope. The nurse squeezed my hand. It's perfect. Later that afternoon, the hallway outside my room filled with voices I recognized but didn't want to hear. We came as soon as we heard, Margot said, her heels clicking like gunshots against the hospital floor. I can't believe she timed it like this. It's the worst possible moment, Delilah replied, right when Dad was giving his toast. I turned my face away from the door. I didn't want them near me. I didn't want them anywhere near my child. When they stepped inside, they were dressed like they'd just left a gala, not an ER. Their makeup was flawless. Their hair hadn't moved since sunrise. Their expressions carried irritation instead of concern. But this time, they weren't alone. 2 police officers stood beside my bed, their presence calm but unshakable. Margot and Delilah, the male officer asked. My mother straightened her coat. Yes. What is this about? You're being detained for questioning related to intentional medical neglect, he said. We have sworn testimony and hospital records indicating a failure to provide emergency care during a known medical crisis. Margot's face paled. This is outrageous, she never said. Please save it for the station, the officer replied. You'll be allowed counsel. As they were led away, I closed my eyes, finally able to breathe again. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for surviving. The hours after their arrest passed in a blur. I was drifting in and out of consciousness, a cocktail of painkillers, blood transfusions, and exhaustion keeping me tethered somewhere between awareness and sleep. Nurses came and went, adjusting for bags, checking vitals, speaking in soft voices that I couldn't always understand. Every time I woke, I expected someone to be there, Jonah, maybe, or even Estelle again. But each time it was only the machines and the dim hospital lighting. Then, sometime after night had fallen again, I heard hurried footsteps in the hallway, followed by the sound of a voice I knew better than my own heartbeat. Where is she? Jonah asked, breathless, his voice full of panic, urgency, and fear. A nurse opened my door and whispered something to him, and within seconds, he was standing at my bedside, eyes bloodshot, clothes wrinkled, hands trembling as he reached for mine. I don't remember if I said his name first or if he did. All I know is that the moment our hands touched, everything I had been holding together finally cracked. I should have been here, he said, kneeling beside the bed, pressing his forehead to my arm like a prayer. Claire, I'm so sorry I wasn't here. You came, I whispered, voice hoarse. That's all that matters now. You came. He looked at me like I was made of glass and fire at once, fragile and burning. His gaze drifted down to the bruises on my arms, the 4-line taped to my wrist, the pale hollowness of my face. The baby, he asked, his voice barely more than breath. She's okay, I said. They delivered her early, but she's strong. She's in the NICU. Jonah let out a sound that was part sigh, part sob, and all relief. He stood and kissed my forehead, then sat beside me, never letting go of my hand. We didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing left to explain. He'd heard it all from Estelle, from the nurse, from the police. He knew what had happened. He knew that my mother and Delilah had left me to nearly die on the kitchen floor while they greeted guests with hors d'oeuvres and practiced smiles. When the nurse came to check on me again, Jonah asked if we could see the baby, even just for a minute. She hesitated, something about policy and recovery time, but then must have seen the desperation in his face and nodded. She wheeled me into the NICU in a chair padded with pillows. I felt every bump in the hallway like a bruise deep in my bones, but I didn't care. I would have dragged myself there if I had to. The moment I saw my daughter through the glass, 1,000 silent fears fell away. She was so small, surrounded by tubes and softly blinking monitors, her tiny chest rising and falling with machine-assisted rhythm. But she was alive. She had made it. She was here. I named her Hope, I said quietly. Jonah swallowed hard. That's perfect. We stayed there until the nurse gently guided us back, promising more time tomorrow. Back in the room, Jonah sat beside me again, never loosening his grip. Estelle saved my life, I said. If she hadn't picked up the phone, if I'd passed out just a minute sooner. He shook his head firmly. Don't go there. You're here. Hope is here. That's what matters. The next morning, a woman I didn't recognize came into the room with a clipboard and a calm but purposeful energy. I'm Dana Collins, she said, and I tensed instinctively at the last name until she clarified. I'm with Hospital Social Services. I'm here to follow up on the report filed yesterday. I nodded slowly. She pulled up a chair and sat across from me, flipping through documents with a quiet efficiency that reminded me of my own office at the hospital. I've reviewed the nurse reports, the EMS call transcript, and the attending physician's notes, she said. You were advised to rest due to gestational hypertension and signs of preeclampsia. Yes, I answered, barely above a whisper. And despite that, you were left alone, even after your water broke, even after visibly entering premature labor. My mother told me to call a car. My sister laughed at me. She looked up from the papers, eyes meeting mine. You're a doctor, Claire. You know what that kind of neglect means. I nodded again, slower this time. I need to be clear with you, Dana continued. This isn't just a moral failure. It may rise to the level of criminal neglect, particularly because they were made aware of your condition ahead of time and still chose not to help. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to scream, part of me wanted to sleep for a week, and part of me still, the smallest, most wounded part, wanted them to come back and apologize like it would fix anything. Jonah looked over at me. You don't owe them forgiveness. Dana stood, preparing to leave. Law enforcement is handling the investigation. We'll be here to support you with anything you need. After she left, Jonah turned to me again. They don't get to come back from this. You know that, right? I know, I said. They made their choice. The days passed slowly, a fog of medications and blood pressure monitoring and brief, precious visits to the NICU. Hope grew stronger with each passing day. The nurses called her a fighter. They said she surprised everyone. I wasn't surprised. She came from me, and I had fought for everything. Estelle visited every evening, bringing magazines and peppermint tea and stories about her late husband that always made me smile. She never asked for anything in return, never pressed for details, just sat beside me like an anchor in a world that had gone sideways. Eventually, word reached us that Margot and Delilah were formally charged. Their names were published in the local papers, which used words like unthinkable and socialite scandal and high-profile neglect. I didn't read the articles. I didn't need to. Jonah told me that Brandon broke off the engagement almost immediately after finding out the truth. He held a press conference, the kind that rich families have when they're desperate to distance themselves from toxic headlines. He said he was shocked and disillusioned by the events and deeply troubled by what he had learned. Delilah had always craved the spotlight, but not like that. As for Margot, her friends vanished one by one, and the charity circles she once ruled with sharp words and polished nails closed their doors to her without ceremony. The woman who once defined herself by the parties she threw and the people she knew now had only silence. They sent letters, handwritten apologies with desperate lines and overcomplicated explanations. Jonah read them before I ever saw them and tossed them into the drawer in the kitchen without comment. I never opened a single one. When Carol came to visit a few weeks later, she asked the question everyone always does. Do you think you'll ever speak to them again? I shook my head. Forgiveness doesn't mean reunion. I don't need them back in my life to heal. I just need peace. She nodded, squeezing my hand. Then I hope you get it. Hope came home from the hospital 3 weeks later. Tiny and perfect, with a grip so strong it left indents on my fingers. Jonah and I had never been more tired, or more grateful, or more certain that everything we had endured was worth it. I didn't look back after that. Not when we sold the house. Not when we moved to a small place in Bar Harbor with a fenced yard and a view of the water. Not when Hope took her first steps under Estelle's watchful eye, or when Jonah got a position at the local clinic and started coming home by 6 every night. Our lives became smaller, quieter, and more real than anything I had known before. I no longer waited for calls that never came. No longer flinched at the sound of my phone buzzing with another demand or insult. Hope was healthy. Jonah was home. I was free. It had been almost exactly 1 year to the day when I found myself standing in our modest backyard, watching sunlight stream through the trees as balloons bobbed gently in the breeze. The grass was soft beneath my bare feet, the deck freshly painted by Jonah the week before, and the air carried the scent of grilled vegetables, vanilla cake, and fresh lilacs from the neighbor's garden. We had kept things small, just a few close friends, Jonah's co-workers from the clinic, and Estelle, who now lived just 2 blocks away and felt more like family than anyone I'd ever shared DNA with. Hope sat in a little high chair decorated with streamers and a single, flickering candle on a cupcake in front of her. She had her father's eyes, bright and observant, full of a kindness I recognized even when she couldn't yet speak. Her hair was beginning to curl at the edges, soft wisps of light brown that framed her round cheeks, and her fingers were sticky with frosting, grabbing at everything with the fierce determination that had already become part of who she was. Michael lifted her carefully into his arms and held her above the crowd like a champion raising a trophy, and the sound of laughter that followed wasn't polite or rehearsed. It was real, deep, warm, and full of love. I stood there, arms crossed over my chest, unable to stop the smile that pulled at my face, even as my eyes burned with unshed tears. Not the kind born of pain or exhaustion, but the kind that creep in when you realize you've finally made it through the fire. Cake's ready, Estelle called from the kitchen window, wearing her usual apron and waving a knife like a conductor signaling the next act. Everyone gathered around the deck table, clapping as Jonah placed Hope back in her chair and helped her blow out the single candle. She didn't understand the meaning of it yet. She just smiled and waved her hands like it was another game, but I understood. I understood what it meant to mark a year with your child when you weren't sure you'd make it to that moment. I understood what it meant to let go of the people who had broken you, and to build something from nothing with hands still trembling from the past. After the cake was served and drinks poured, Carol appeared beside me with a glass of lemonade, and that look she always gave me when she was about to say something I needed to hear. I was thinking about that day, she said quietly. The call, the hospital, the fallout. It still doesn't feel real sometimes. I know, I said. It feels like it happened to someone else. But it didn't, she replied. It happened to you. And you survived it. That's the part one thing people miss. You didn't just get through it. You rebuilt your whole life. I looked over at Jonah, who was holding Hope on his lap while she smeared icing across his shirt with reckless delight. His laugh was unrestrained, echoing across the yard like music. He didn't look like a man who had once been 1,000 miles away, begging strangers for updates about whether his wife and daughter would survive. He looked like home. They tried to come back, you know, Carol said after a long pause, sipping her drink. Margot and Delilah. I ran into someone from your mother's club. Apparently, they're not exactly welcome anywhere these days. I nodded. They've sent letters. Emails. One of them even sent a basket when Hope was discharged from the NICU. Did you read any of it? I read enough to know nothing's changed. There's no real remorse. Just shame at being seen for who they are. Carol was quiet for a while before finally asking, so what happens next? Nothing, I said. They're not part of this life. They weren't there when it mattered, and they don't get to pretend they care now. Forgiveness isn't owed just because someone asks for it. She raised her glass in a quiet toast. To boundaries. To peace. I answered, clinking my glass gently against hers. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the dishes had been washed and stacked neatly beside the sink, I sat on the porch with Hope asleep in my arms and Jonah beside me, his hand resting over mine. The sky had shifted to deep lavender, stars beginning to peek through the fading light, and the sound of the waves from the nearby shore was soft and steady. I was thinking about her name again, Jonah said, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. Hope, I don't think we could have picked a better one. I named her when I thought I might not wake up, I said. I wanted her to carry something with her that reminded her she came from strength. She'll know, he whispered. We'll make sure she knows. I watched the moonrise reflect across the yard and thought about everything that led to this moment. The hospital lights, the cold floor of my childhood kitchen, the oxygen mask, the steady hand of a neighbor who didn't owe me a thing but gave me everything in return. I thought about Margot's face when the police walked into the hospital room, and how Delilah looked more concerned about the public fallout than the fact that I had nearly died. I thought about the silence that followed after their arrests, the sudden vacuum where their voices had always been, and how freeing it felt to let that space stay empty. Do you think she'll ever ask about them? Jonah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe, I said. And when she does, I'll tell her the truth. That family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who reaches for your hand when everyone else looks away. Jonah nodded, his eyes damp. She's got the best mother in the world. That's all she needs. I rested my head on his shoulder, listening to the rhythmic breaths of our daughter and the quiet hush of the ocean, and let myself believe that he was right. That maybe, after everything, I had become the person I always needed in my own life. The future no longer felt terrifying. It felt open, hopeful, earned. I didn't know what would come next, what new challenges, what old ghosts might still rise, but I knew I wouldn't face them alone. I had Jonah, I had Estelle, I had Carol, and I had Hope, whose laugh could shatter shadows and turn grief into light. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I wasn't waiting for approval or afraid of disappointing someone who never saw me clearly to begin with. I had built something stronger than the lies I'd been raised with. I had found my peace in a life that was small and beautiful and mine. And that was more than enough.